Welcome to the Winged Wheel Podcast. Here to talk all things hockey are your hosts, Brad Crisco, Ryan Hanna, and Evan Lobsinger.
We didn't have enough money to buy the Red Wings ad patch space and leave it blank. And I worry that we're not going to have enough money to buy the team name for Utah HC, as it were, but I really feel like we're missing some good opportunities here to get the Winged Wheel Podcast more concertedly in the NHL space. The Utah Dub-Dubs, the Utah Evans, the Utah Shut Up Brads, there's something in there.
The cheese bags.
That's it right there. You know, every once in a while we get a new listener who's like, hey, love the show. Why do you guys say stay fresh cheese bags? And we don't do a good enough job explaining like the lore of the show. So this is just a recurring explainer. One of our listeners and our patrons started to use the sign off stay fresh cheese bags a long time ago, and it just stuck on the show. So now it's become like within the patronage, especially, it's as synonymous with the Winged Wheel Podcast as like the Dub-Dub or even the initialism WWP. So anyways, welcome to this remote episode of the Winged Wheel Podcast. We don't typically do these, but just because of scheduling, it's going to be a remote episode. So forgive the quality of this time around. But the good news for you is that we have a good interview, a Red Wings roundtable this episode as we look forward to it. But for now, I'm forced to let Brad and Evan to their own devices because we're not all in studio. And so I can't wrangle Evan for the life of me.
Well, on this Utah naming situation, I feel like debacle might be a little strong. 8 options have been trademarked. Ryan Smith was saying that it's a greater than 50-50 chance one of those team names is selected as the eventual team name. They're all terrible. But Mammoth, Yetis, Outlaws, elite logo potential there. So that's where I'm going to put my preference is in one of those 3 stupid team names. Mammoth and Yeti are okay, but if they don't screw it up, those could be some of the best logo jerseys in the NHL, especially since he keeps hinting at they're going to keep the purple theme.
Well, there's a great sponsorship staring them in the face if they go with Yeti, although all the Stanley people will be very upset.
You're going to piss off one crowd one way or another, but we'll get to that. For now, welcome to the Winged Wheel Podcast, here to talk to you about all things Detroit Red Wings hockey, the world of the NHL, and the virtues of Yetis versus Mammoths. I am one of your hosts, Ryan Hanna.
I'm Brad Crisco.
And I'm Evan.
On this episode of the Winged Wheel Podcast, we are going to give a sneak preview into our thoughts about Steve Yzerman's job this upcoming offseason and what should be done, what will be done, and what might happen in the world of Hockeytown and the Detroit Red Wings. Everything from Seider and Raymond to Kane and lots more. So this is going to be an ongoing conversation. So from us specifically, you'll hear just about, what's top of mind for us. And then what we're going to do after some Red Wings news is jump into a bigger conversation with Max Bultman and Prashanth Iyer, where we do a Red Wings roundtable, where we dive into those kind of deeper topics. Prashanth and Max are going to kind of give some scenarios. We'll have discussions based on, what kind of contracts need to be moved and what the cap structure might look like for Detroit. What's the solution to net and all of that good stuff. And then we'll come back to you with a quick playoff update, some NHL news in terms of the Utah names, and more before we jump into overtime. Before all that, I want to let you know that this podcast is primarily supported by our Patreon supporters. Patreon.com/wingwheelpodcast if you want to support the show and join the so-called Dub-Dub Club. You get access to some really great benefits like all of our bonus Patreon exclusive overtime episodes. You are also automatically entered into all of our giveaways. For example, this past season, we gave away 2 tickets to every Detroit Red Wings home game. And you also get access to our Patreon exclusive Discord community. So all of that and lots more. Again, patreon.com/wingedwheelpodcast. Okay. So when I say Red Wings offseason, what's the first thing that comes to mind for you? And I mean, what do you really think is the 1 or 2 things that are most critical for the Red Wings to figure out, not necessarily to guarantee playoffs next year, but to take the appropriate next step in this, Red Wings evolution?
Youth movement. And I don't mean that tear it down, start the rebuild again. But the Red Wings have an incredibly strong, incredibly deep pipeline of prospects. If you don't find space for them on the roster, eventually you lose them or you age them out. Now, I know most of these guys are B-level prospects, and when you're talking odds of those guys panning out, yeah, I understand more will flame out than not, but between Kasper, Danielson, Mazur, Johansson, like at a bare minimum, 2 of them need to be on the roster next year, ideally 3. They have a lot of UFAs coming off the board. A couple of them, at least, they're going to keep. And I think it's critical to keep at least a couple of them. I'll let the listeners decide who that is. And they've probably got a couple more candidates, non-UFAs, that they're going to try and punt into the sun. So there will be roster spots available. And I don't want the Red Wings to necessarily take a step back, because if done properly, I think there's a way that Kasper or Danielson or Johansson are upgrades on whoever they're replacing in the roster if done correctly. And if there are buyouts or trades and a couple more roster spots come available that aren't currently available, there's a world where you upgrade through free agency or trade. I'm firmly in the camp of no more Comfers, Schrotts, Cops, whatever. And some of them have worked out, don't get me wrong, but these late 20s, early 30s guys who you have to overpay by a year or two in term and $1 million or $2 million in AAV, done. No more of those. 0. If you are not able to land, a quote unquote top 6 forward or top man in free agency, that's when you find the Christian Fishers, the 1-year stopgap. So I want to see some rookies next year, and I want to see significant upgrades or stopgaps, because their cap situation sucks, and it's because of the Cops, the Schrotts, the Comfers, the Justin Holls, etc., etc., etc.
For me, I don't disagree on the youth movement, and I think, Brad, something, and you'll hear Prashanth and Max talks about this too, the cap situation dictates that the youth movement is going to have to come in, because those players are cheap. ELCs are cheap. It's as little as you're ever going to pay for a player, and the Red Wings have the luxury of having a really high-end prospect system, so you're not only getting a cheap player, but you're having one that has not a guarantee to be effective, because it's hard to be effective as a rookie or a young player in the NHL, but a better chance than most teams would have with their prospects. So that's a problem that's almost has an opportunity to solve itself. For me, what I want to see is one minor thing and one major thing. The minor thing is you have to offload some kind of contract. There's no real discussion around it. There's contracts that aren't working for Detroit. Some are more movable or buyoutable or whatever than others. I've reached a point, and this is an evolution in the rebuild, where I'm very comfortable spending picks or assets, not premium, but the wealth of picks to move those assets. Yes, you're accepting that you made a mistake. Yes, you're accepting that it could have been avoided, but the NHL cap system is not a game of perfect. You have to constantly be working with it. There are teams who have been in worse positions. You can't just sit here and lament the past, which is a rich statement for me to say. We go on air twice a week, and pretty much a lot of the conversation is lamenting the past. That's the nature of covering a team in the rebuild. But I want to see some creativity in terms of moving a couple of those contracts out. And the second, and this is, I understand, not going to be very likely, I want to see something creative in terms of a big move here. Like, names get brought up quite a bit in terms of who could be that top 6 forward or that high-end defenseman, a guy where you'd really have to pay a lot or take a risk to make a trade, for example. I think the Red Wings are in a position to do that. You have to find a partner, and you have to find the right price, and it has to be an appropriate risk, and it's not like you can just go shopping for that. So I'm not going to say there's a specific deal that should be done, but, Trevor Zegras is a name that's thrown around a lot. Some people might not be a fan of that. I think he's a guy with high-end skill whose value is pretty low right now, all things considered. It might be a risk worth taking. Do you want to sign a guy who is absolutely a top 6 forward if Kane leaves? Not everyone would like the idea of Gensel, but that could also be an option. Like, there's different things I think you should explore here. And even if it doesn't happen this offseason, I would like to see kind of the exploration of that concept with the Red Wings, because, they never got the lottery luck. And they've done a good job drafting Seider. They did a good job drafting Raymond. Edvinsson looks great so far. But you're going to have to supplement them with some other assets here. And you have to kind of GM your way out of it, in my mind.
Yeah, I agree with what both you guys are saying. I think there is a lot of room to bring up some of the young guys. And I think Steve Yzerman addressed it specifically that, he had to make room for a couple of the guys down in Grand Rapids who have expiring contracts like Berggren and Johansson as well. So it'll be interesting to see how they fit them in with the puzzle. And the big, the real big question is what's happening with Lucas Raymond and Moritz Seider. Both of those contracts, I think, need to be done first before they can really fill in the rest of the puzzle pieces. And if there's anything we know about Steve Yzerman, he's notoriously lengthy in his contract negotiations. So the clock will certainly be ticking, and Steve Yzerman's not a guy who moves fast. So it'll be very interesting to see how those contracts net out. Obviously, we'll talk about those a lot. But yeah, the Red Wings have a lot of different areas of focus this offseason, not just in terms of roster construction, but, RFAs, UFAs, who can they trade for? So it's going to be a very interesting offseason for the Red Wings.
A good note about the Seider and Raymond thing is in the end of season presser, Yzerman, said some interesting stuff that led you to believe that, you could read that maybe the negotiations were a little bit of a grind, which wouldn't be surprised because players in Raymond and Seider's position have a lot of leverage in terms of, they might not want to sign for 8 years because that's advantageous for the team, but that's not really advantageous for them as already and potentially even bigger future stars in a rising cap era. But also, Yzerman is exploring the amount of term that works. And so it could possibly be that he wants 8 and the other players don't, or that he's open to a bridge or a semi-bridge or like a 6 or 7 year term. So that opens up a lot of possibilities, even though the conventional thinking might be, sign it for as long as you can. If the player is just not going there, and they're a good player who has leverage like Raymond and Seider do, or if the team in a cap structure where if they shave some years off and, basically push a problem to the future when the cap's higher to save themselves from a problem in the cap now, there's a lot of different ways this could work. So all of those really good points. Now, the one thing we didn't name is Patrick Kane, because not much has changed in that situation, but he put out another statement, a post today that said, "Thank you, Red Wings, my teammates, coaches, and all the fans of Hockeytown for welcoming me and my family with open arms this season. This past year gave us memories we'll never forget. The work doesn't stop." So the most optimistic you could be is that this is still just negotiation, that he's not guaranteeing that he wants to come back because he wants the term from the Red Wings, and Yzerman's not, fond of giving someone his age that kind of term. The pessimistic, and some might call it realistic view, is that he's saying, I'm exploring free agency. The fit for the contract in terms of what Detroit's offering isn't there. So this is my goodbye post. So I don't know where you guys land. I have a hard time finding myself being optimistic, but I wouldn't say it's, the writing's on the wall completely.
I'm not super optimistic about this situation, but it has nothing to do with that post. That's probably just a bit of, yeah, this is a great season. Thanks for the ride, guys. And a bit of, hey, Steve, we're negotiating through the public now. Are you willing to ante up? It happens a million times a year with every team, right? It's your subtle public negotiation tactic.
He didn't have the hashtag Let's Go Red Wings in his post, so I am extremely concerned. There's no allegiance left. Patrick Kane is testing the open market.
That's it? The hashtag with the emoji is the dictating factor for you?
100%. Where was the octopus emoji?
Well, then you'll be happy to know that he did finish it with a hashtag LGRW. So,
oh, perfect.
According to Evan Lobsinger, Patrick Kane's returning. So if he doesn't, everyone should DM and tweet at Hockeytown Evan, because it'll be his fault if this doesn't pan out.
I will read every single one of them too.
Okay. That's just a little bit of our thoughts. This is going to be the conversation of the summer. I know, Brad, you had some thoughts after I was talking about Seider and Raymond's contracts with Yzerman, but we're going to save that. We're going to jump now into our Red Wings roundtable with Max Bultman and Prashanth Iyer. Max Bultman of The Athletic Detroit, Prashanth Iyer of Expected by Whom, obviously works closely with us as well. So really great to be able to do these Red Wings roundtables. And one of the more interesting ones, we joked a lot that part of the Red Wings being good all year means that we didn't have to use up all our off-season content starting in January and February. So there's quite a bit of meat on the bone right now to discuss, which is what we're going to do in this roundtable. So without further ado, Max Bultman, Prashanth Iyer, and myself for this Red Wings roundtable on Steve Yzerman's offseason. Enjoy. We've been saying that just because the offseason started for the Red Wings doesn't mean it starts for us making content. And I have to give a massive shout out to you guys. I can't even start this with a joke at your expense because you're here with me at 10 p.m. right now recording this. So I should be staying away. I should be nice to you guys for the next calendar year for doing this. Max Bultman of The Athletic Detroit, Prashanth Iyer of Expected by Whom. Thank you both so very much for recording this late night Red Wings Roundtable. How are you guys doing?
Well, I'm going to say it's 4 p.m. in Hawaii, and I'm only just back from 24 hours, so it's really not that bad for me.
I just like the implication that Ryan hasn't been nice to us for the last calendar year, and that's something he has to consciously try to do.
I'm excited. I'm trying to build up like my cool profile, pretending I'm really mean to you guys. But no, appreciate you guys coming on, and what a whirlwind. We were just talking about how crazy life has been, and that starts with how crazy the end to Detroit season was. So that finish was, you couldn't have written that more intensely. And if you're a Red Wings fan, the only thing you would have changed is Philly wouldn't have pulled their goalie at the end of the season. What did you guys make of, April 1st onwards for the Red Wings and the end to that season?
As exciting of hockey as I have covered, which is since 2018. It was fantastic, high event. I don't know that it was always fantastic hockey, but it was fantastic content to cover, right? It was thrilling games. Every single one was a heart stopper late, whether it was a win or an overtime loss. They were in these games right to the wire that were so meaningful and to the bitter end, right? I mean, they are not eliminated until after regulation of game 82. In a game they won. So I thought it was as thrilling, as exciting of hockey as I've covered. I know that's a small sliver of the time a lot of people listening to this have been following this team and all that, but it was quite a thrill.
Yeah, I mean, I'm right there with you. Even though I've been watching this team for 25 plus years, we haven't really had good hockey to watch for the last 8 to 9 years. And all of a sudden to have the Wings kind of close with that ferocity that had been missing, really just that was playoff intensity. And, folks were, I saw some people making stupid comments like, oh, why are the Wings celebrating, those kinds of goals and those kinds of games. This was the best hockey the Wings have played in a long time. And, especially after that backslide and finding themselves still right in the thick of it. And then to have, their final 3 games all be, all need to be wins, all needed to have points, and to come out of it with, 5-4 overtime wins, back to back to back, I think is what it was, with Toronto and then the 2 against Montreal. It was just, an unbelievable finish to the season, although, it kind of sucks that they come up short.
The theme of this roundtable today is a look towards the offseason. Like, what needs to happen for the Red Wings? What do we think is going to come in the future? What job does Steve Yzerman have ahead of him? But let's give a moment here. This past season overall, 2023-2024, Detroit finishes with 91 points, and as you both have mentioned, they just barely missed the playoffs. How do you summarize, or how are you feeling about Detroit's season overall in terms of expectations going in and the end result? Obviously, you've both alluded to there was a backslide in March, and they had the playoff spot and they lost it, so there's a lot of nuance. What do you make of that? We'll start with Prashanth.
Yeah, I think from the expectations, for me, the way I like to view it is comparing it back to what I had them at preseason. I had them at 87 points. They finished with 91. So they obviously beat expectations there. Now, the addition of Patrick Kane, partway through the season was certainly a huge help for them. But by and large, the results they achieved were better than what I was expecting them to achieve. And so for that, I think that's a huge positive when you're looking at the Wings, that they were able to stay right in the thick of it and play a meaningful game 82 as Derek Lalonde wanted them to do. So for me, that exceeds expectations. Now, the way they got to those 91 points, I can say I'm not necessarily a huge fan of. They certainly struggled at 5-on-5. They took advantage of, very opportunistic shooting at times. And were able to get goaltending they didn't expect from Alex Lyon throughout the season. So, when you're thinking beyond this year, is that going to be repeatable? I don't know. But for when we're just analyzing the season as it happened, they were better than I expected. And that's something that we have to consider a positive when you're looking for how does this team get to the next level. The reason they were better than what was expected was largely because of the growth of Lucas Raymond down the stretch, Dylan Larkin taking his game to another level when he was healthy, and then being able to bring in that veteran presence in Patrick Kane, who played at a point per game pace, the whole year. So I think those were all hugely encouraging signs as you look forward. So for me, it's a better than expected season.
Yeah, I think that last point Prashanth made is the key here too. I have all the time in the world for fans who are really disappointed. And I wrote a column at the end of February that told them to believe. So I am, my ass is out there, right? But, I think that the most important thing that needed to happen this season, was to see that kind of step from a Lucas Raymond, to see Simon Edvinsson in those kind of games. I still think it should have been more than it was, but you saw him in 14 of the most important games of the season, and he was really, really good. I was on a radio show last week, and they asked me to grade him, and I thought about it for a second, and I'd just go straight up A. I thought it was a straight up A. That, not that he was perfect, right? Like there were a couple mistakes, but for where I expect a rookie defenseman to be in those kind of games, surpassed every expectation that I would have had for him. And I think I was one of the louder ones saying he should be in this lineup. So, and obviously I think similar story for Seider. I know the toughest usage in the NHL. It's going to color some things. Was he perfect in those minutes? Obviously not. But I think you continue to see just huge growth from those three key young players. I think you even saw from Dylan Larkin. So even though I know it was probably the most excruciating way to have all that happen and have it seem like it's building toward this, miraculous, I guess, or maybe it wasn't miraculous considering where they were, playoff berth, and have it ripped away. You don't learn all that stuff to the same level about Lucas Raymond and Simon Edvinsson and Moritz Seider and even Dylan Larkin, without seeing them in those games that matter. If those are 4 games down the stretch that don't matter, A, do they step up to quite that level? And B, do we care as much if those are 2 meaningless games in Montreal as opposed to 2 massive games in Montreal? If it's a meaningless game in Toronto as opposed to a massive one. So I think that's the most important thing that happened. And I almost think that alone makes it, something worth saying, like, okay, that's, you can work with that.
It's funny you say your ass is out there for what you wrote at the end of February, Max. I can never imagine putting out any content with, that kind of unbridled optimism that's out there, immortalized. Okay, there's a lot that can and will be said about this past season, but, there's almost a whiplash after Detroit won and then lost effectively, where we were immediately looking forward to questions that had nothing to do with, on ice play, but rather, is pen going to hit paper soon? People are talking Patrick Kane right now, but I think you can't talk about the Red Wings cap structure without looking at the extensions for Mo Seider and Lucas Raymond. Max, you're going to drop a piece, I believe, in the next week or so here that it's going to be required reading, so we won't spoil too much of that. But overall,
it's out there. I put it out at the smartest time for a journalist to put something out, Friday at 5:30 p.m. So it is already out there. Why Lucas Raymond and Moritz Seider's extensions are the key to the Red Wings offseason.
And that's linked in this episode description. But let's jump into that. Those two are going to dictate what Yzerman can or can't do. And the traditional thinking is you sign your best young players for as long as possible. Is that the path the Red Wings are going to take here? Should that be the path they take? And what tea leaves can you possibly read?
It's really interesting. Basically, before the year, my expectation, my prediction was that this year was going to end. Moritz Seider was going to sign for 8 years at a really big number in the 8s, and Lucas Raymond was going to bridge. And my thinking on that has changed significantly. I now think that, there may still be some bridging with Raymond, depending on what you qualify as a bridge, right? But I think the Red Wings have to have seen enough from Lucas Raymond now, and Raymond's demonstrated enough that there is now the path toward a long-term deal, right? Nobody has really huge incentive to try and do a 2-year deal here, I don't think. If anybody does, it's Raymond's agents, but not to the degree that it would have been if he had had another 55, 60 kind of point year where it's good player. There's definitely more in there. I think there definitely is more in there, but I think now it's kind of out there enough that there's a pretty clear pathway to them seeing eye to eye on something longer. Is it 8 years long? That's where I'm not sure. When I asked Steve Yzerman what he thought about some of the long-term deals out of ELC, he was a little cautious in his answer, talking about, it's got to, make sure it proves value for both sides. And that includes the team, and not wanting to pay an extreme premium for potential. I guess my counter to that is, at this point, is it an extreme premium, and is it really potential? How much of it have we kind of seen from Raymond? But could that make it end somewhere along the lines of where Dylan Larkin's deal did in terms of term, 5 or 6 years? I think that's possible. I think that, obviously from Raymond's side, that gets him to free agency at 27 or 28 if he wants to. And that's probably not a hard sell. If you want 8 years, you're taking him to 30. So to me, that's where this thing meets the road is somewhere between 5 to 8 years. And I think if I had to guess, 6 seems like something that I could see both being pretty content with. 6 years. I'd be very curious when Evolving Hockey submits their projections on him, or on everybody actually, and to see like kind of what they would ballpark a 6-year deal at, because there's not that many comps. The comps are kind of either Trevor Zegras 3 years at 5.75, or you're going up. And I think by now with Raymond, you're into the 8s on an 8-year deal. I don't know if you're quite at Tim Stützle 8.35, but Prashanth, I think you might even endorse that based on some of the conversations we've had.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like you said, this is where everything's going to start, and it's fascinating what the Wings have available to them. And I think ultimately, at least the way I read it, is it's going to be more dependent on what Lucas and Mo want than necessarily Steve's desire here. And I'll kind of back up in stating that with the way that the cap is expected to go up over the next several years, and sort of this maybe recent, I don't even want to call it a trend, but there's been a recent sprinkling of a few of these, maybe bigger name players signing a couple of shorter deals, similar to what we saw happen in the NBA back when, the cap basically doubled. You were seeing folks start going for 2-3 year deals. I don't think it'll happen to the same degree, but that's something to be considered here, is that do we see more players starting to opt for that, knowing that they can make another, bigger contract, potentially when they either get themselves right to a restricted free agent and the cap's gone up, $12 million since their last deal. And so for me, looking at Lucas and Mo, it's almost advantageous to both of them that if they're like, hey, I'm going to be a better player in 3 years than I am right now, I take a shorter deal. It'll be interesting to see if that's what they ultimately end up opting for. If I'm Steve Yzerman, Lucas is a no-brainer 8-year deal. Going to what you said at 8.3, shoot, up to 8.5, I think 8 years, 8.5 million is a no-brainer for Lucas Raymond right now. He's clearly taken his game to another level where he's dominating shift after shift after shift. And you really heard him say it, the exit interviews, that really the difference is consistency. That's what separates the elite players from the good players from the average players, is being able to do it night in and night out. And you saw that from Lucas down the last, 25 games. And so for me, he's taken it to that level. You want to get him at 8 years if you're Steve. Mo is a little bit different. And I think prior to the beginning of the year, I would have said 8 years slam dunk. Midway through the year, I'm pretty sure I said 8 years slam dunk. But now the question of is, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, coming up here, is that the Wings have about $28 million in cap space, and they're going to have to fill a lot of roster spots, and they're still going to have to get significantly better. And so do you attempt to shorten the deal for one of those two to potentially save yourself a couple million, in the hopes that you don't necessarily shoot yourself in the foot 5 years down the road, knowing that right now you're trying to compete with your roster that has Dylan Larkin, has 3 more years of Alex DeBrincat, potentially has, Patrick Kane back if he comes back, or another big name free agent. But that's maybe the window. And if that's the window, then maybe you do shorten the deal for Mo. And he's the one I sort of think you do that on, because I don't know how much more he's going to add to his potential future contract value. I don't see him playing power play 1 and going up to a 70-point defenseman that, takes that up there. I don't see that. So if he's consistently going to play the same minutes, same production, give you that 40 to 50 points, he's maybe not as big of a jump. And maybe that's why you go a little shorter with him.
So there was an Yzerman quote that kind of speaks to that line of thinking. And he talked about, I asked him about these contracts, and he said, there's a lot of them out there. How many are improving value of the team? And then you look at, okay, how much more would they get if they were unrestricted free agents, right? And that's kind of what you're saying, Prashanth. With Moritz Seider, you can look at these comparables for the guys on ELC, right? Owen Power's over 8 million now. Jake Sanderson, I think, is either at or just over 8 million now. We think Brock Faber has a chance to get that same kind of deal this summer, all out of ELC. So it's the market rate. Like if you're going to sign Mo for 8 years, it's an 8, right? It's an 8 million-ish, or it may more, probably a little bit more deal. He's got, more points than all those guys, and points tend to be how you get paid on these contracts. With that said, You look at a guy who I think is a really effective top pair, if not number one defenseman, has a little bit more points, a few more points this year than Mo did in his game, and just signed a long-term extension. That's Noah Hannafin. Noah Hannafin is not making $8 million a year. Noah Hannafin's at like I think it's 7.3. I don't remember the exact number. And that's kind of falls in line with what Prashanth's saying. Like, if you think Mo is going to continue to produce right around where he's been doing, and maybe his game gets more effective in the underlying numbers, and maybe a little more, maybe there's a little more offense to it, but it's not an enormous amount more. You're not talking about that 65, 70 plus point range. Then yeah, maybe you are just talking about pretty much the same contract with the cap going up. That's okay. It can still get to 8 million 2 years from now, if that's what it's going to be. And then you just saved a little money in the short term and kicked it down the road. And frankly, in that scenario, you actually lock him up pretty favorably. You don't have to make a decision on him at 30 or 31. All of a sudden, he comes to free agency at 32, 33. And then those deals tend to be a little more manageable at that point versus at 30. That's always a dicey time to do a free agent. So there's an argument to be made there, but there's certainly also an argument that just says, these are your pillars. Lock them up. What are you doing? Right. And so that's like the tug of war that he's going to have this whole summer. I think Prashanth's spot on. I think what they and their agents want is going to dictate a lot of this. You have to think the Red Wings have seen enough out of Moritz Seider and Lucas Raymond to know they want them here for 8 years, and it can kind of be a blank check situation in that way, except for Steve Yzerman can't actually operate with a blank check. There's a salary cap. And so there's that push and pull of what makes more sense. And if you're going to bridge one, I do tend to agree with what Prashanth said. I think that Seider's the one that has less risk of points explosion in the next 2 to 3 years. It could change if he's a PP1 guy. And I tried to kind of ask Derek Lalonde what he sees there, and he did a pretty good job of not committing on the answer. So we'll see what happens there. But to me, that's everything. That's the foundation of the offseason. If you spend $14 million on these two guys, you got a little more room to go add a difference maker. If you spend $17 million on these two guys, you're pretty close there. It gets a little, that $3 million can be a big difference in what kind of addition or splash you can make before some subtractions. And I do think there will be some of those. I'm sure we'll talk about that later.
The sexy news right now, even though, Seider and Raymond, those are the pillars and no one can deny that, the hot button issue right now is Patrick Kane. It went from him being asked towards the beginning to middle of April, and Patrick Kane was saying, yeah, I love it here. And, January, February, everyone was like, oh, God, what a great fit. Of course he's going to stay. And after he scored at the United Center, everyone was like, God, of course this guy's going to stay in Hockeytown. To pretty firm, as you reported, Max, it seemed like the tone changed. And it seems like Kane wants term, and Yzerman's not exactly the type to offer that up. And Kane is now going to be a 35-plus contract officially. And that complicates things. It's harder to bury cap. It's harder if a guy gets injured or retired. It makes things a little bit more messy. There's a lot less confidence, and I'll say my betting money is that Kane goes. What happens here with Kane? What options does Yzerman have, and would you even offer him the kind of term that he'd be looking for?
Well, it's I agree that it was a tone shift. From what I understood, right? I expected that press conference to be a lot more like, would like to be here, et cetera. And I don't think that he did anything to dispel that. It just didn't sound like there was a ton of confidence that was going to happen. And term is a word that stood out to me when he was talking. I think he's earned the right to ask for that stability and want that stability. My question is, what does that mean? Are we talking about 3 years here? Or are we talking about 4? 3 is probably the upper limit of what I could envision. It's a little itchy still. I think 2's kind of the sweet spot. If you're Detroit, you're pretty confident in 2. And my guess is 3 is the word that is the number that makes me think of the word stability. So maybe that is the line in the sand. I think he was a huge piece for the Red Wings. I mean, there are some stylistic things in there that are fair quibbles. Like, he is not a dogged forechecker. He is not a defensive player. Also not what he needs to necessarily be to be, what he's ever really needed to be effective. But, there are steps the Red Wings are trying to take, kind of identity they're trying to build. My feeling is I think you can always make room for one of the smartest hockey players of all time. But that has a price point and a term point. And, I'm talking myself in circles here a little bit, but I think that speaks to how tricky a decision it is, right?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And to start, we would be talking about something relatively unprecedented, at least in the last 6 years or so. You don't see a lot of guys that are in the 33, 34, 35 range that get more than 2 years. Really, if you're trying to pin down a comparable contract, you look at what Ottawa did with Claude Giroux. And Claude Giroux is probably the closest example to a Patrick Kane situation, where he ultimately signs 3 years, $6.5 million in Ottawa, and signing age, I think, is 34 on that one. And that's maybe the most you're willing to do. And while Giroux's been a productive player for Ottawa, you can see that he hasn't necessarily moved the needle for Ottawa in the first 2 years of that deal to the point where they're in playoff contention despite all the young players that they have. And so, you do have to be a little hesitant that, yes, even though it is Patrick Kane and he very clearly proved that hip surgery worked and he is back to being a terrific dynamic player, you just have to ask yourself, can you commit that much money in term when you're not necessarily set in stone, if you will, with the base that you've got to really elevate this team into the playoff picture?
Let me give you 3 names here, Prashanth. All guys who are in their, we'll call it mid-30s or later, all expected to be free agents this summer, barring an extension. Patrick Kane, Steven Stamkos, Jonathan Marchessault. Who would you sign of those 3, and what do you think it would cost?
For me, it's Marchessault. So Stamkos has been a little bit of a power play merchant. Like, yes, he's hit 40 goals, 41 points, but I want to say half of his goals this year are on that power play, and it's kind of nice when you're taking passes from Nikita Kucherov, across the dot there to kind of buffer your goal total. And really,
that does
Stamkos he had fallen off substantially until the last part of the season, where I think he finished with, I want to say 17 goals in his final 18 games or something like that. So this was really a huge push down the stretch, but I am a little wary of Stamkos, obviously with the shoulder issues, 34 sniper, not really bringing you too much else besides that power play dynamic, from that dot. So I'm going to stay away from him. Patrick Kane, we obviously know what we get in him. We saw it. I just think Marchessault is a little bit of a better skater, a little bit of a better forechecker, and puts the puck in the net via goal scoring versus playmaking. And I actually think that the guy that can independently generate scoring chances without necessarily relying on other players is the guy that the Wings are missing. You look at where they were at in 5-on-5 offense generated this year, towards the bottom of the league. I think they were one of the league's worst for long stretches of the season. And so to me, seeing a guy like Marchessault, who's still at 33, can do this from first, second, third line, depending on where you're at, continues to put up 40-goal seasons. Even though he's got that, even though he's only 5'9", it's adding another small winger to your Alex DeBrincat and your potentially, I wouldn't call him undersized anymore, but Lucas Raymond and then potentially other wingers you might add. I still think he's the right type of player where I feel a little better about giving 3 years to than a guy like Patrick Kane, who's got a little bit more age to him and a little bit more of an injury history.
Yeah, there's not that many teams that have 3 sub-6-foot wingers in their top 6, right? Like in the playoffs. And that would have to be the concern. But I guess your argument is Marchessault has a little bit of that honey badger to him that, at least stylistically, he's a little more of a pain to fend off in the ozone on the forecheck, all that.
Yeah, that would be where I would go. And again, if you're looking at comps, I mean, Vegas, obviously their defense group is tree towers, but up front, they've never been a particularly massive team, if you will. So, they've been able to get away with some of the smaller guys up front on different playoff runs. And Marchessault's obviously played a huge part in that. I mean, we talk about, those types of wingers not being in the playoffs. Well, Marchessault's a guy that has been there and produced extensively. So,
they're in it. It's are there 3 of them on one team? It's
yes.
And Raymond, I think I agree with you. Like, I don't think he's playing small by any means, but you just kind of anthropologically, right? You look at some of that stuff.
Yeah, it's again, we're so far past the realm of things that are common or expected in terms of multi-year deals for 35 plus guys, bridging a guy like Mo Seider. We might as well just fully commit to we're just having a short team. I think what Max, it's you that says low man always wins, right? So
I do. Low man wins. That's right.
Even though Brad's not in this roundtable, he will appreciate our short king advocacy. So you guys are good friends. We got into, if not Kane, then who? And I think that's a good discussion to lead into. Detroit has a lot of other UFAs and decisions to make on the board here. David Perron very clearly wants to come back. Like, he's been very passionate and open about that. And there have been reports that the Red Wings are interested in bringing him back. Daniel Sprong, I think we all know the story on him. It doesn't really seem like he's a guy who's on the in right now, although I'm not saying anything's for certain. Christian Fischer's another UFA. Joe Veleno's an RFA with arb rights. Shane Gostisbehere is probably going to command quite a bit of money, being near 60 points. And then James Reimer, I don't think people are really thinking about too much, but that's a few big decisions to make. Do any of those stand out to you as they will come back or should come back?
Perron seems like a good bet, right? And not just because he pretty clearly wanted it. I think he's a big culture piece for this team. And I know people get sick of hearing that. I know he's not the fastest player, and it stood out at some times this year that made me think like, okay, like how much longer is he going to be able to, but he came alive down the stretch too, right? Like in the same way Prashanth talked about with Stamkos, he didn't have 17 goals in his last 18 games or anything, but he scored some big ones and he set up some big ones. And he is one of those players that consistently showed he knows what it takes to play playoff hockey. He had the physical element down. He mentally obviously is built for those kind of games. And I do think something the Red Wings are going to have to do after we follow kind of our low man wins, short king love segment here. I think the Red Wings do have to get a little tougher to play against. They have to get a little more responsible. Yes. They also have to get a little heavier. Hard to do all those things. They're not going to have a ton of cap. I don't think they can make sweeping changes. But I don't think David Perron's the kind of guy you want to be subtracting as you're trying to do that stuff. Because I think, and you could really look at St. Louis and see what happened to them when they thought they could, move on from David Perron. So that to me feels like it, he's at a point where I don't think he's going to be asking for the moon in terms of a contract. I think he's an important piece, and I think you make an effort to make sure that one goes your way.
Yeah. I'm with you there as long as the dollars make sense. And it goes back to the first thing you said. The Wings aren't going to have a ton of cap room. So if we sort of shape up the conversation by saying the Wings have 6 forwards currently under contract with the Rasmussen deal that kicks in, the Wings will have 6 defensemen, I believe, under contract, with Sherratt, Holl, Wallman, Maatta, Petry, and then Seider, obviously will be there as well. You sort of talk about those. So now you've got those 12 players. And then if you add in Raymond, that makes 7 forwards, so 13. Plus you've got Ville Husso and Alex Lyon lined up. So you've got 15 roster players. You've got 8 spots open. And if Raymond and Seider come in commanding about, let's say, best case scenario, $14.5 million. So that leaves you with about $13.5 million to fill 8 roster spots. And it gets tight there. And so obviously I think it goes back to the first thing you said, Max. There's going to need to be additional subtraction, but to bring back a guy like David Perron, I think the dollars have to make sense. So, I like looking at Dom Luszczyszyn's market value to see what a player of Perron's production would typically make on the open market. This year it's $3.4 million. So to me, factoring a little bit of a regression based on age and kind of situation next year, if you can get Perron in a $2.5 to $2.75 million, 1-year deal, I think that makes sense. If he's coming in asking for anything more than 3, I'm a little more nervous there. I don't know if you feel different on that number.
No, I think that's the right ballpark too. I was going to say right around 3, I think makes sense. You want to make sure you're being respectful of a guy of his, accomplishments and importance to your team, but you also, there's a little bit of this. You're looking for like, hey, you want to be here because you want to take the next step. This is what it's going to take for us to take the next step, that kind of thing. The other guy I think that we should mention, it's not a splash name. It's Christian Fischer. Like, I don't think he's going to be super pricey, but man, did he seem to kind of be a key to getting the most out of Kopp and Rasmussen and creating that checking matchup identity, whatever you want to call it, line that when they were together just seemed to tilt the ice about as well as we've seen a line in that role do for the Red Wings in years, I think. And so I think if that number makes sense, I don't think that's going to break your bank. 1.2, 1.3. You know, maybe it's a little more than that. Like, I think, yes, maybe that's a role that you think, hey, you can plug Carter Mazur into something like that. But I think you might be able to plug Carter Mazur into a different role than that and still keep Fisher. And that seems to be like a piece that's working. I don't know that you want to mess with that too much.
Yeah, Fisher certainly thrived in Lallone's system this year. You know, if you look at Red Wings players that within the dump and chase system, nobody had a higher rate of recovered dump-ins per 60 minutes than Christian Fischer this year, based on Corey Schneider's tracking stats for the Red Wings specifically. So he was very prolific in terms of being able to get in on the forecheck, pressure the defenseman. That's exactly the type of player you want in your fourth line. I think there's two things that I want to be wary of. One is this roster finished with 91 points fighting down the stretch. And you could argue to an extent they overperformed what they deserved, particularly with their 5-on-5 offense generation. I don't think we'll expect this team to shoot the second highest shooting percentage at 5-on-5 next year. I don't think you'll expect nearly every player to exceed their goals above expected next year. So knowing that, I am reticent to commit too much to bringing too many folks back from the same team. But if you are to pick, the two that I think to pick are exactly who you've named, Max, being Perron and Christian Fischer. And if you can bring them in combined for under 3.75, you know, or under 4, you know, now again, you're still talking about $9 million for 6 more roster spots. But it is still doable if you've committed. The second piece of all of this being if Steve's committed to those ELCs, which was another kind of hot topic that he mentioned to an extent, that knowing Berggren and Albert Johansson are not going to be waiver exempt anymore, they'll likely have to factor into the roster next year. And so if there's also additional consideration for a Marco Kasper, a potentially Nate Danielson, and a Carter Mazur, you know, in the lineup next year, now you've been able to get younger, cheaper, and still leave a little bit of room to go bigger, then I think you can do all of that and bring back Perron and Fischer.
Were you guys surprised that he named Berggren in that press conference? I mean, it's been a little bit of a roller coaster, it seems like there. Were you surprised to hear him name him?
Felt kind of like negotiation, and not like a almost positive negotiation. Like, hey, I know this has been frustrating for you, but hey, look, here's light at the end of the tunnel, and you'll have a spot, right? Because you don't want to lose Berggren for nothing or little on the dollar.
I want to go back and see how Steve referenced Filip Zadina at the end of last year and what the expected role was for him. And the only reason I bring that up is not because I think it's a similar situation, but there are some similarities in the sense of potentially a guy wanting a larger roster spot or a larger role or betting on himself. I don't necessarily think you're going to have the same end result, but I am just curious and cognizant, and that's something that sits in the back of my mind, is that does Berggren ask for a change of scenery if it's not fully committed? And this is, again, Steve's way of sort of stating he's going to be a big part. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, Max or Ryan, you guys may remember better. I do vaguely remember a quote talking about Filip Zadina is going to play an integral part on our team next year.
I just looked it up. There's a quote from that press conference. This is Yzerman. What I'm really hoping on, it might only be incremental, but our younger players all chipping in a little bit more, able to do more. Joe Veleno being able to contribute a little bit more. Filip Zadina, Lucas Raymond, all of our young guys, everybody chip in a little more. So that definitely is what you're saying, Prashanth. There's a definite indication there of counting on you, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah. So that's the only other thing I'm going to just state in the back of my mind that just sits there is, you know, I don't want to lose Berggren in that scenario, but the way that he's sort of been up and down and sort of utilized within the roster sort of points that he's not the next man up, if you will, or the team's immediately jumping to get him playing time. So I do think he's going to be a scenario where he ultimately has to earn it, and I'll be curious to see what that means for him in the offseason and if he ultimately does want to change the scenery.
Discussed a little bit there, so we'll segue into it about young players coming in. Asked about Axel Sandin Pellikka, Yzerman said nothing certain. They hadn't talked about it, but he feels like there's a good chance that he'll be in Sweden for another year. But then you start to think about guys like Nate Danielson, who really, in all honesty, had a really good camp for Detroit this past season, and on a worse team probably would have made the team. You think about Carter Mazur, who looks to be ready. You look at Marco Kasper, who's really come on with the Grand Rapids Griffins and will probably challenge to be ready. And then, as he mentioned, Albert Johansson and Edvinsson's already up. That's a lot of young roster players. So on the one hand, it would solve the issue of, like, you know, you get those guys in cheap and you fit in under the cap and you don't have to necessarily spend to get rid of contracts. But on the other hand, is it really Yzerman or Lalonde's MO to fit in that many effective rookies?
Yeah, the number I have in my head is 4, and that counts Simon Edvinsson, who's not a rookie technically. So if it's and Johansson, I think is going to be one of those 4 because he's not waiver exempt. So I leave 2 more spots. I would count Berggren as that too, even though he's not a rookie. If he's there, I tend to lean where Prashanth is and think, like, I don't know that I actually see that one coming to fruition, but he did talk about it. And, you know, he does have some of those, like, kind of creative skill, vision elements that you would lose in a Kane. But yeah, I think 3 or 4, maybe 3.5 is where I'd set the over under on that. Like, I feel pretty good that you're going to see Edvinsson, Johansson, and I would say Mazur. And then can you get one more? Can Nate Danielson make the team, or can Kasper make the team, or do they keep Berggren? 3.5 would be my over under.
Yeah, I'm probably in the same ballpark with guessing how many will be there. My gut, though, is there should be more. In fact, I think all 5 should be there. When we're talking about Edvinsson, Mazur, Danielson, Kasper, and Berggren, I personally believe that at this point with this Wings roster, you have to start cashing in on this prospect pool. I think, you know, we've talked a long time about the ability to develop these players, let them sit. The Wings have, you know, been a number 2 prospect pool, number 4 prospect pool, depending on whose rankings you're looking at. But now is sort of the time to convert those players into NHL action. I think we saw that it took a little bit longer for Marco Kasper to adjust to North American ice. And so do you want Axel Sandin Pellikka to have to wait that year? You know, Moritz Seider had the advantage of playing in the AHL the year before going to Sweden. And so already had an element of North American ice, introduced for him there. Simon Edvinsson, same kind of thing. So for me, if I'm the Wings, I personally want to bring Axel Sandin Pellikka over next year. And at a minimum, have him play in Grand Rapids if he can't crack the roster from the get-go, but give him a shot. I think we're seeing a change in how teams are utilizing their younger players in terms of moving them through the development process a little bit faster in terms of getting them closer to seeing what the NHL level looks like. You know, if we talk about the 2023 draft, we've already had 6 players make NHL debuts. And that means 3 of the guys that were not in the top 3 have already made NHL debuts with, you know, Zach Benson, Gavin Brindley, and then Bradley Nadeau, obviously last game of the season for Carolina. But even going back to last year's draft, I mean, we've seen Frank Nazar get in 3 games and score. Liam Ogren's gotten into 4 games. Miroshnichenko has gotten into 20-plus games. Yuri Kulich has played. Brad Lambert has played. You know, so to me, it's time to start getting those peers. You know, you're seeing those peers of that draft who were similar talents, didn't necessarily overperform relative to what you saw from a Kasper and Edvinsson and Danielson. You got to start moving those guys up. You got to start moving them forward, because if you don't know what you have and you start hitting situations like Albert Johansson where now their waiver exemption is gone and you're forced into a situation, or it's either use it or lose it. And then I think the other thing we always forget is that the older these players get, their value goes down in a potential trade or package that you're trying to acquire another top player. So for me, I think it's time to start cashing in on what you've got in the prospect pool, whether that is dealing them for elite talent, whether that is moving them into the AHL and NHL and putting them in a position to take the next step.
Now, here's the thing, though. If they do that, they have to do it knowing that it probably, and it may be a step back anyway. It probably means a step back in the standings. And if you're doing that, and I know that's going to be a popular idea with fans, the standard no longer becomes playoffs. If you're promoting all those guys, and I don't know that they want to do that organizationally, right? I don't know that they want to say to all their guys that they just, asked to go lay it on the line to make a playoff push all this time. And the players want to do that too, obviously. It's the players' baseline. That's not the baseline if they have 5 or 6, first year NHL players basically in the lineup next year. It's just not going to be. It's not, I'm not saying it can't happen, but that's not the standard. They would have to overperform to get back to 91 points if that's what their lineup looks like.
you can paper over a lot of that, though, and I'm being halfway serious here, with an elite goaltender.
Yeah, where you got one?
Used him up already. Sorry, I thought it was Alex Lyon for about 20 games there.
It was. I mean, like that's real, right? And it's just, but everyone's looking for that, I guess, is kind of what I'm saying, right? Like I think Winnipeg's kind of a good example of that, right? And we're coming off, as we record this, they just beat Colorado by scoring 7 goals on 23 shots in a playoff game. But Connor Hellebuck makes you a cup contender, period, right? Like, as long as you have like solid depth in front of him. And I think that, I was really impressed by Alex Lyon this year. I think he's proved he's a legit NHL goalie, can be part of a tandem. My question is mainly with the tandem they have. A, do you trust Ville Husso to stay healthy? And B, who is he? He had an .892 save percentage when he was healthy this year. Are you comfortable? I asked this to Yzerman and I didn't get a straight answer. Are you comfortable going into next year with Husso and Lyon as your tandem? And that is still a question of mine as they go into the offseason.
It's not impossible for Husso to come back and between him and Lyon be able to get like 65 good games out of him and 17 stinkers, which would be a tacit improvement over this past season. But I think as a fan or as someone in the organization, you would be crazy to assume that that is going to be the case, right? Like, he re-injured himself and apparently wasn't even the same injury. It was just, you really feel for the guy, like talking to Ville Husso, like he really was just pining to get back. And you can't imagine how devastating it was to re-injure twice. So like, again, it's not impossible, but I just don't know. I just don't know that the Red Wings are going to want to go into next season with, it's not going to be the same thing, because if it's Husso and Lyon and whoever else, it's not effectively the same, but it kind of feels like it's effectively the same.
Yeah, I think if you're going to go out and you're going to get yourself in the Jacob Markstrom or Jussi Saros or Linus Ullmark derbies, and each of those have their own questions to them, by the way, and then you want to go with a kind of a younger lineup and say, hey, let's see what this looks like. I mean, there's a case for it. Mazur and Kasper bring those elements that they lack. They bring the heavy, they bring the hard area scoring. I'm hesitant to say an NHL rookie ever really brings you the defensive responsibility, but over time, that is expected to be a real part of their games. And if you want to say, hey, give this a whirl, and we got a guy in the net that we think can cover up some of those mistakes, like, I'd love to cover a team like that. I think that's there's storylines every single game, basically, right? I'm just saying, I think there's going to be hot competition to get in on those 3 goalies I just mentioned, assuming all 3 move, which is not a guarantee. And B, it's still like a dicey proposition to get back to 90, I think, because you just don't know what you're getting from those young guys yet. And that's not a reason not to do it. It's just well, I guess it is a reason not to do it, but I'm not saying it's like a flat out do not do it. It's just that's the risk.
So where I'm at here is, and I know obviously you move all those young guys in, there's going to be growing pains, there's going to be learning curves, a lot, for some of these guys, it's going to be much faster hockey than they've ever been a part of. What I'm going to argue is this. I think most of those players, you could transition, at least the forward group, you could transition by playing them on the wing. I think it is exponentially harder to transition directly to center in the NHL than it is as a winger. We see it with face-off percentages as an interesting surrogate. A player's face-off percentage is lowest in their career during their first year, followed by their second year, followed by their third year. And it gets better and better and better as they learn how to play center in those defensive responsibilities. I think in a Mazur, a Kasper, even a Danielson, you could transition them by starting them on the wing, because you do have centers that are there in Detroit. If you bring back Joe Veleno as a restricted free agent, he has the ability to slide there, and you've got Comfer, Larkin, already there as well. You have the ability to figure that out. And so I think there is a potential to make their transition easier. And then the second thing I'll say is, this team that we watched this year, yes, they made a playoff push and they got to 91 points. They got there in game 82. I can't harp enough that this team overperformed their metrics. Like, they were 26th in 5-on-5 expected goals for, 24th in 5-on-5 expected goals against. They were where they were because they shot the second best shooting percentage at 5-on-5, for the season. They were league average on the power play, and their penalty kill should have been abysmally worse. I don't think a lot of people realize this. They were 31st in expected goals against allowed shorthanded, but 3rd in shorthanded save percentage. And so this was a team, to me, that could have been a lot worse if the bounces didn't go the way that they did for them and they didn't get that kind of hot shooting streak. And I just don't see that happening again next year. So to me, this is sort of the chance where, can you make your 5-on-5? I mean, can they get any worse? Your 5-on-5 metrics here? You may not get the same luck, but there was no guarantee you were going to get that luck with a veteran-laden lineup next year either. And so that's where I'm at. And then you guys already know where I stand on goalies. Don't spend money on goalies. You know, it's a waste of time.
I will say back in the, yeah, that's right. Back in a simpler time.
He's the one in the playoffs.
Back in a simpler time where I thought Patrick Kane re-signing in Detroit was a given, I did toy around mentally with the idea of a Danielson comp for Kane second line. And I think that would be a quite interesting way to break into the NHL as a young player. You got a defensive ace with you right there who can do a lot of the center stuff, and you can switch on and off with him kind of as situations warrant if Detroit wants to do that. And you got one of the players that Danielson certainly will have grown up watching and you know, seeing his highlights and all that, and all of a sudden you're playing with him, learning from him, all that. I don't think that's a bad option, but it does require you to sign Patrick Kane to create.
Well, or Jonathan Marchessault, let him play with the sniper, right? But you know, Nate Danielson, his game took off in Portland. I mean, after he was 26 points, 26 games with Brandon, and gets dealt to Portland. Then he goes for 41 points in 28 games with Portland, including, and this is the first and only time you'll ever hear me use plus minus, but he was plus 20 in 28 games with Portland. And so to me, it just sort of indicates, and again, I'll back up. The only reason I'm using plus minus, there is no other data available for the WHL. So you could stop there. That's the only thing I have. But I think his game got a lot better, and he showed that he has the offensive capabilities. And then right now in Grand Rapids, we're seeing Marco Kasper do the same thing. His puck handling skills are a lot better than people had anticipated, myself included. And he's starting to find that game that made the Wings want to bring him over at the end of last year. So I see no reason why not to try it at this point.
The one thing that you said, Max, is organizationally, it doesn't feel like this is an organization that's going to want to take a step back. People aren't going to want to hear this, but the money matters. Like, the Red Wings started filling seats. The prices are going up. The revenue matters. The league wants the Red Wings back in the playoffs. All of those are non-competitive, but very real external factors. And so I tend to agree that there's going to be an immense amount of pressure and want from the organization. And I want to make this clear. I don't think this is just coming from Chris Hillich, for example. I think Steve Yzerman wants the same thing. He has mentioned it before, but I think there's going to be a lot of apprehension toward any kind of step that's going to pull you away from the playoffs. I don't mean that they're going to sell out everything to try to make the playoffs every year, stupidly. But I think if they're in any kind of area of margin or kind of gray zone, they're going to err towards trying to do again what they did this year.
Go back to March. How many people listening to this right now, be honest with yourselves, uttered fire Lalonde or fire Yzerman in a year that they improved by 11 points? Be honest with yourself. How will you view a year that is a step back from that in the wake of that, right? I think it's not just inside the organization either. I think that there's fan pressure around this too. I think it would be crazy to not think that's a factor.
Okay, so we did the goalies. And if you think about the Red Wings right now, even though they had that big improvement, as you said, Max, they definitely need to improve in net. You know, if they lose this offense and Kane and others, they're going to have to improve up front. They need at least one top six forward. And then also they need help on defense. That's been the story all year. You talked a little bit about who do you bring in. Are there any other names to you via trade, via signing? Did we already name them with the prospects coming up that can really solve those issues to bring a net improvement to this team?
So for me, if I'm doing a postmortem on this team, the biggest area you've got to fix is your 5-on-5 offense, and really the way that Lalonde plays. The Wings just couldn't find a way to play with speed. Their forwards ultimately had to carry the puck out of the defensive zone, which limits their ability to transition with speed as they're going against, 4 guys in the neutral zone. And then similarly, that forces them to dump the puck in. And then when they dump it in, they're not able to recover those dump ins. So for me, I'm looking either for forwards that have the ability to forecheck aggressively, the type of players that would play in a Carolina system, that would play in a Florida system, that would play in a Vegas system, those types of players that are able to do that. So for me, Jonathan Marchessault is a great answer to that there, at least as a winger, a guy that can do that with elite scoring talent. And then the other thing you're looking for is a defenseman that can actually beat multiple guys with a first pass. That was one of the biggest problems for the Wings this year is the puck would get dumped in, they would go to recover it, and their defensemen could not beat defenders with the pass, and they could not skate past him. And so ultimately, it was a lot of either clear outs or scenarios where they would have to make one pass to the forwards, and then the forwards would start from flat-footed to skating the puck out of their own zone. And so for me, I'm looking for a defenseman that can make a better first pass out of the zone. Problem is right now, I don't really see a lot of those available in free agency. And so you're going to have to potentially pick on teams that may be a little tighter against the cap. Vegas is obviously the team that stands out, but I don't think they have anybody they're necessarily going to part with. So I think that one is going to have to come from internal. And then in net, we've obviously talked about potential goalie upgrades, but I think that can only happen if you get somebody to take Husso, because you've got $4.75 million already committed to Ville Husso. We've already talked about the fact that you may have only $13 million for about 8 roster guys. And if you're not willing to bring up 5 ELCs, you can't add a big name goalie unless you're shipping out Ville Husso or another high dollar player. And so I don't think that can really change internally either, unless you think Sebastian Cossa is ready, which I don't think he is yet personally, but it wouldn't hurt to get him a couple games, either at the beginning or the end of the year, just to see where he's at.
Right. And Edvinsson will solve some of that puck moving. He is a guy who can, with the stretch pass or with his legs, beat the first defender. That'll help some of it, but I don't think you'd flinch at one to get another one of those guys either, right? I think a healthy Jake Wallman can do that. But I do agree. And I look at the breakout, and I actually look at it on the wings a little bit, the wingers, I should say. They're all wings, Red Wings. And I think they got to be cleaner on that. I think that's when you look at some of the turnovers we saw, Red Wings defensemen throwing the puck up the boards. Some of that is the wingers are missing those rims. Some of that is the wingers are not where they're supposed to be. Some of that is they're just not guys that can take a pass on their, that part of their stick and get it cleanly into space, right? They're going to feel pressure. They're going to be rushed. I think that is an area that the Red Wings have to improve on, is just the breakout. And I look at the wingers for that. Honestly, that's one of my gripes with Jonathan Berggren's game, is I don't think that's a strength of his at all. I think he, in the offensive zone is where you see him shine. That's no secret. He's 23, all that stuff, caveats apply. But if you were to tell me, name the number one reason Jonathan Berggren didn't play more for the Red Wings this year, I would point to not getting the puck out on the breakout and what it led to in terms of defenseman turnovers, trying to have to flip the puck out, rim the puck out, and all the bad things that usually follow when you do that.
Our last roster question here. A lot of conversation about who do you bring in, but there should be more honest conversation about who gets shipped out. I mean, there's, a lot of noise around, is there a buyout coming for Justin Holl? Do you try to move Olli Maatta's contract because that seems to be fairly movable? Are there any kind of prime candidates in your mind where Yzerman can save himself some space and buy a little bit of breathing room anywhere on the roster in this regard?
Holl's definitely the big one. I mean, that's the guy that you're scratching more than half the season while paying $3.4 million. Honestly, I think both parties probably want a redo on that, right? Justin Holl wants to play hockey. He doesn't want to sit in the press box for all those important games down the stretch. I think he hasn't said that to me, but I'm pretty confident in saying that. So that's the obvious one. I think if you are looking, I agree with Prashanth. If you are going to look at a goalie upgrade, which I think they should, you got to find it. Ville Husso's got to be going out in that deal or in a supplemental deal. I'm curious if there's a because if you look, we talked about this cap crunch. They're a year out from it getting a little cleaner for them. Couple guys, and I think they'll bring Jeff Petry back. I just think, I know people don't want to hear it, but I think on the third pair, it's a little more fluid. It's 1 year. It's a cheap hit. It's, to me, that one, I think you can stay in, but it is only 1 more year. Olli Maatta's got 1 more year. Robbie Fabry's got 1 more year. Maybe you can, a deal like that. I don't know that those are guys that they're like looking to move per se. Fabry's cap hit's a little higher than I think you want for the role. But he still is a guy who looks like, he can score between 15 and 20 goals really reliably for you when healthy. And he was healthy this year. I think that, probably got undercovered by me. Honestly, that was a pretty big accomplishment to stay healthy for him. And Olli Maatta was one of their steadiest players. It was a sheltered role for sure on the third pair, but you could set your watch to him. So I don't know what their guys are looking to move out, but if you're hard up for cap, those are probably movable deals, I think.
Yeah, I think this comes down to what maybe my biggest gripe with a lot of the Yzerman deals have been with free agents is it's not egregiously bad for really anybody. It's just, it's $1 million more than you maybe should have given that person. And so none of the deals.
And a year more.
Right. And a year more. It's like $1 million more and a year more than you should have given that person. And so what that ultimately means is, setting aside Justin Holl, I think we all can agree is the obvious candidate to be shipped out, given that he's not playing and he's got 2 more years at $3.4 million. He's the guy that needs to go to buy some space, but no other deal really stands out as egregiously bad because they're all just slight overpays and slightly too long. And so those add up at the end to where you wish you could have $7 million back by taking, $1.5 million back from Kopp and $500,000 from Comper and, $1 million from Sherrod. And, you're sort of going down, you're going, I wish I could have those millions back. And they all add up to a very nice player. But the problem is not one of those really in and of itself is an egregiously awful deal. That being said, maybe it makes it more attractive to move any of those guys. But with Kopp's term, he's not going anywhere. You obviously just signed Comfer. He's not going anywhere. Rasmussen just got his extension. He's not going anywhere. And you're not giving up on DeBrincat and obviously not Larkin. And so that really leaves you candidates only on defense to move out. And again, I don't see Ben Sherratt having a big market, and he did play a little better at times this year. Still think he's playing a little above what he should in terms of what he can handle. But if you get him down, it's, again, a contract you can handle. Hall's the one that you got to get out. Wallman, when he's back, is going to make a big difference when he's healthy. And Olli Maatta, even though Maxie said he's steady as a rock, and he was. I mean, if people go and look him up, he actually, I think, had a lot of the better metrics, albeit in very vanilla competition for the Wings this year. But could you get somebody else that could do that for $1 million, and maybe you save a couple million there by being able to move out Olli Maatta? And I agree with you. I don't see Jeff Petry going anywhere, strictly because I think he was brought back to finish his career in Detroit. And so I don't see him going anywhere. So really the candidates for me are Justin Holl, Ville Husso, potentially Olli Maatta. And then if you don't want to pay Joe Veleno, you trade his rights.
Yeah. Okay. So we talked about you don't want to run back too much of the same roster, but I think on D, it's going to be a lot of the same guys. You might only get one real ad beyond Edvinsson. So you're looking for the optimal. I think it's a 2RD, right? You got to slot Petry to the third pair, whether that's with Sherratt. I think Sherratt Petry is like a plus third pair, honestly. So if you're Wallman, Seider, Edvinsson, right defenseman X, Sherratt Petry, or you could even flip Sherratt and Wallman depending on how you want these to look. But who's your ideal right DX? Is it Brett Pesce? Is it Chris Tanev? One guy I'm curious about Connor Murphy in Chicago. A little bit of an offensive black hole, but a good stopper defensively could be kind of interesting. Anybody come to mind for you guys?
I don't mind the idea of Connor Murphy. I'm just wary of going from Goss to spare 60 points to Connor Murphy. Feels like that would be too intense of whiplash. But I like what you said, and this was an idea that, I mean, you guys brought up a long time ago, but the Tanev short term, it feels like such a sensible fit, especially considering you're either going to be putting him with Edvinsson, or if Edvinsson graduates to that first pair, then with Wallman, that works extremely well, and it keeps people on their proper sides.
I think that Philip Peronic guy is a restricted free agent. He might want to come back, right?
Yeah, there's your $7 million gone out the window right away, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, Max, what you said, Brett Pesce is as solid of a rock in terms of a shutdown defenseman that you can find. Another guy that I think could make sense if the payday isn't too expensive is Sean Walker, who just got dealt to Colorado. He's a right shot defenseman, can play left or right side, but had really nice numbers in Philly. I think he's a potential, again, if you can keep him under $3.5 million, which I'm not sure you can. He seems like a nice guy that can offer you some minutes. And then the guy that everybody's always clamoring for, at least that I see now, is Matt Roy out of, the Kings. And I'm not as enamored with his game as I am Sean Walker. I think Walker would be a better 2RD in my opinion. But yeah, that's another option. And then Dylan DeMello is also a right shot defenseman in Winnipeg. He's a little bit older, 31 now. but potentially another option there who can also eat a bunch of minutes for you.
Do you think Matt Roy trembles at the thought of being the latest local guy to come home and become a target of fans' ire?
The newest Michigan pariah.
That's right.
I don't know that the Utah Yetis would do it, but Sean Durzee's a restricted free agent with arb rights, and he's always a guy that I've looked at, and I wish Detroit would have made him before. Not that he's easily acquirable, but the Arizona at the time did acquire him from LA.
Yeah, I mean, Jersey, I mean, he was at one point very gettable for a lot of teams. Maybe it was that deal that just ended up being very cheap, but yeah. Are we going with the Yetis, by the way? Is that what we've decided?
Utah HC, baby.
No, HC? I can't stand that. That drives me nuts. As a big fan of the Washington football team, I can't stand Utah HC because the football team always felt temporary to me. I don't mind the Outlaws either.
Outlaws would be fine, but bringing us back on track, the only other name I'll throw out there for you that I know Max is going to love this one, but Jalen Chatfield in Carolina. Now he's more of a third pair than anything, but he is a tremendous skater, and I think that is one thing that the Wings could use to add on their back. On the defensive group, is a guy that can skate the puck out of his own zone. Now, plays third pair with Dmitry Orlov, basically has to save Orlov's butt in Carolina whenever he goes, fishing or whatnot. But Chatfield is a pretty reliable defenseman, albeit in third pairing minutes.
Yeah, to me, that's the only I like Chatfield. It's just like, is he more than a 3RD, right? Because if he's a 3RD, then it's just still Jeff Petry on the second pair. And we know fans love that experience. Petry and Edvinsson, I thought played okay. Maybe that'll give the Red Wings something to think about there. But my thought is that they're if you're trying to upgrade there, you're looking for like a slam dunk 2RD, top 4 right D.
You guys know Tyler Myers is coming. Okay. We are running late here, and I am not going to make you guys ask the question that Steve Yzerman hates, which is 5 years in, where are you in the Steve Yzerman Yzerplan rebuild? Where folks are going to get that answer is from Max Bultman's work with the Athletic Detroit. I already linked one article in the description. Also go to his Twitter at M_Bultman and click on any of the articles that he links. Subscribe from that link. That's the best way you can support Max, and I promise you it's worth the price of admission. Prashanth Iyer, you can also hear him on Expected by Whom, which you should subscribe to and listen to, but he is also going to be coming out with his If I Were Steve Yzerman off-season plan at some point this off-season, so you can look forward to that as well. Gentlemen, thank you both. It's very late. I owe you both some bourbon, although, Prashanth, I think you and I are both drinking bourbon right now, so Max, my recommendation to you is that you go join, but I appreciate you both jumping on the show.
Thanks for having us as always. It's great.
You got it, man.
This episode of the Winged Wheel podcast is proudly brought to you by Labatt Blue Light. Created in 1983, this premium light Canadian Pilsner is a delicately balanced beer brewed with Cascade hops and a blend of malt. It's fresh, crisp, and brewed to the highest quality standards. There's a little bit of Canadian kindness in every sip of Labatt Blue Light. How did it get in there? They're Canadian. That's how. You can spread the love yourself by sharing a Labatt. And when you do share a Labatt, you're not just sharing a beer. You're sharing an experience that'll pair with anything from hockey to a hoedown. So next time you're watching a hockey with your buds, be sure to share a Labatt, because while you might not all root for the same team, although we on this podcast do hope you're rooting for the Red Wings, you can all enjoy a Labatt Blue Light. We honestly love going to games in Detroit and seeing Labatt being the beer that fans clamor for all over the arena. It's a reliable beer and great to have in your hand when celebrating a goal. So head to the link in the description of this episode or the one you see on your screen to find Labatt in stores near you today. You must be 21 or older, and as always, enjoy responsibly. All right, welcome back. That was our conversation with Max Bultman and Prashanth Iyer on the Red Wings offseason. So great to hear from them. And again, that follows up our kind of primer on the topic. You can see why there's going to be a lot of different conversations heading into this offseason. And that doesn't even span everything. So I know we say this every year, but it really does feel like the most consequential offseason in terms of moving parts that we've seen so far. And as much as some of it might seem overly negative or maybe on the other side of the spectrum, overly optimistic, it is a good sign that, things are really moving along in the rebuild. It doesn't go from all terrible, all bad, like the lowest lows of the rebuild to all of a sudden you're, the Florida Panthers this year overnight. It's iterative. It's not a straight line. And so it's a sign that the pieces are moving, because there were a lot of years where we had some tough off-season episodes where we were talking about, oh, God knows what. I'm surprised Brad didn't jump over the table and throttle me for the main segments I brought in, because when you're a team at its lowest lows, it's not pretty. And parts can't move because there's nothing you can do to move them. So this is a speculative time and maybe a little bit more unsure than some Red Wings fans would like. But if you take the perspective, it's all good stuff. Let's get into some NHL news. Utah. It looks like they're going to do a Qualtrics survey bracket, as Ryan Smith is the founder of Qualtrics, or the owner of Qualtrics. And it's going to be 8 names, all based on trademarks that have been registered. The Utah Mammoth, the Utah Ice, the Utah Yetis, the Utah Venom, Utah Blizzard, Utah Outlaws, Utah Fury, and Utah HC, standing for Hockey Club, seem to be the names in contention here. And I'll tell you, when it was first just like Utah HC or Utah Venom, I was like, oh, brother. But there's a few decent ones in there. I like the Mammoth. I like the Yetis. And I agree with what you said at the top of the show, Brad. There's some elite potential in terms of logos here. Like, lean into like ECHL, like have fun. Don't worry about what the old heads say. Like, just do something unique here. Like the Kraken, I think, went that direction with their team name, and their branding has been a huge success. And I think it fits. I like it better than the Golden Knights. I think the Golden Knights is a stupid name, but their jerseys are sweet and they have a brand now. Winning a cup helps. I don't mind the Mammoth and I don't mind the Yetis, and I think those are going to be the 2 most popular ones.
I agree. If I had to guess what the final of this bracket will be, it would be those. And the Utah Jazz have had some bangers over the years in terms of uniforms, especially when they really leaned into the purple. If they go with the color scheme of the like late 90s, Stockton Malone era of the Jazz, these could be the best jerseys in the NHL with like a giant mammoth or a Yeti logo. Again, weird names. I'm not the biggest fan, but they could absolutely knock this out of the park if they have a good design team on top of this one. And of course, what's going to happen? We know this thing's going to get John Scotted, and a million other fan bases are going to come in, and they're going to be the Utah Ice because everybody else will think it's funny.
Can't wait to have a nice cold Utah Ice while I watch the Utah Ice play ice hockey.
The Utah Ice, supported by Labatt Blue Light.
The Utah state bird is a seagull. It's right there for them. They could be the Gulls. I'm not against that at all. They could have some great logos. They could have a great mascot. They could get a little goofy. That's my vote.
And when you go to the concession to get a basket of fries, they just throw them on the ground in front of you.
The employees follow you around when you have fast food.
Oh, that's good. I agree with you though, Brad. Like I saw someone had like a Stags mock-up, and the logo was sweet, but my favorite part was like the mountain ranges and both the purple and like the like kind of sunset color scale. Like you can have a lot of fun with that one. So those mock-ups were phenomenal. The only downside with that is Stags is a phenomenally stupid name for a professional sports team. I didn't mind it, and you know what? The inappropriate pun potential is still there. And
big fan of that. That is its redeeming quality.
Hockey fans are just meatheads who have childish senses of humor, so that's all they care about.
That's kind of why I'm hoping Fury pulls out an upset win in this bracket, because the obvious jokes will get old fast, but we'll capitalize.
The official state insect is the honeybee.
Okay. Not gonna lie, the honeybees would go hard.
Killer bees. The buzz.
That's not bad.
I think it's stupid.
You're kind of painted into a yellow and black color scheme, which I don't love, but
the official state fish is the cutthroat trout.
I heard there was like chub suckers is one. That's a fish. I'm not editing that out. That's a fish.
Well, if we're doing that, the soakers has to be on the table, right? Like, if we're doing that, that's got to be included.
Well, one of them is like the NHL name, and one of them's the AHL name.
Exactly. There we go. We're settling this all right here.
All right. I have to move us on because this is getting out of hand. Quickly here, a playoff update as the NHL playoffs first round is underway. Quick update on where the series are. As of recording at this moment, it's just before 7 p.m. on Wednesday night. So Florida is up 2-0 on Tampa Bay. Toronto and Boston are tied 1-1. The Rangers are up 2-0 on Washington, and Carolina is up 2-0 on the Islanders. Edmonton is up 1-0 on LA. Vancouver and Nashville are tied 1-1. Winnipeg and Colorado tied 1-1. And Vegas is up 1-0 over Dallas. That'll be changed by the time you listen, but that's where we are. We can talk about whatever, but first I want to talk about Sergei Bobrovsky treating us to one of the best saves that we'll see in a generation. Holy, was that unreal.
The Tim Thomas school of goaltending. Get yourself so out of position that you have no choice but to make a spectacular save. And much like Tim Thomas, Bobrovsky seems to do it successfully a lot. This one was just, he was backwards going cross crease, and I forget who shot it for the Lightning. They didn't whiff on it. Like, that thing was going top corner, and he got his arm on it somehow backwards. It's nuts.
My favorite genre of goalie save is backwards goalie saves, and they don't happen often. I remember once a while back when Carey Price had his last resurgence in his career, where he did a post-to-post slide to save the puck with his, what would have been his pad, but he was literally facing backwards and just calmly went post to post and saved it with the back of his skate. And that kind of mutant, you're a freak of nature, you're not the same as other goalie saves is my favorite. Sergei Bobrovsky, he's one of those I'm good on odd years goalies or whatever it is. But when he decides to turn it on for the playoffs, when I say a goaltender can win you the Stanley Cup, I mean, what Bobrovsky is doing now could be the difference in a Stanley Cup. And it's funny that Tampa Bay is facing that because they've done that to plenty of team over the past few years. Speaking of goalies, Thatcher Demko out for probably the series. Oh, that's a hard one for Vancouver to swallow.
Well, it was good of Vancouver fans to rally around Casey DeSmith, and they were chanting his name to give him encouragement. It didn't work because a garbage goal went in as they were chanting his name.
I don't even have anything against Vancouver fans, but it's just any Canadian market is just pure insanity, and the sick, twisted sadist in me does enjoy watching, just sometimes when the hockey gods deliver the cosmic pain to the Vancouvers, the Torontos, it is kind of fun to see how the fans react to it. In any case, I don't think Vancouver's absolutely out of this. It's not like they're guaranteed to lose the series, but that one hurts. That one really hurts. Toronto won game 2 against Boston. I actually think they did relatively well. And I was surprised because it was not long before that where I saw the clip of Mitch Marner just absolutely giving up on a puck in the offensive zone. And I was like, how is this still Mitch Marner, man? How is he still doing this?
He's trying to lower the price for Detroit in the offseason.
Yeah, no kidding. But it's just more of the same narratives in Toronto. That's the same circus it is. And then finally, the Islanders blowing a lead, giving up the lead and then giving up the go-ahead goal all in 9 seconds in the third period, and Washington going down 2-0. It really does feel like 14 teams and 2 people who are just like Michael Scott in that handshake meme. If they win 2 games between them, I will be a little bit surprised.
Hey, we said if the Red Wings got in, we knew they'd get smacked, but we'd just be happy to be a part of it. I think they're playing like they have the same mentality.
I picked Rangers in 5, and I'm really starting to doubt if Washington's even going to get one because, it's nice that Washington's there, I suppose, but man, the Rangers look like they're just playing in a different league than them right now.
I wouldn't be entirely shocked if Lindgren stole 1.
That's why I put 1.
If you're holding Alexander Ovechkin to no shots in the playoffs for the first time since 2018, you're doing something right. Washington was never going to be a cakewalk for Lindgren and for Ovechkin reasons, but yeah, if you're doing it that decidedly, where you're holding the greatest goal scorer of all time to no shots, you're doing well. Okay. For the sake of not running long, we're going to move this episode of the Winged Wheel podcast along to Overtime. Overtime is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. Patreon.com/Winged Wheel podcast if you want to support the show and join the Dub Dub Club, the bonus episodes, the Discord, the giveaways, all of that and lots more. You allow us to support the Jamie Daniels Foundation. You allow us to continue to grow the show and make it bigger and better and run it during the off season. You also allow us to produce great content like the show Expected by Whom, hosted by Prashanth Iyer and Sean Shapiro. It really means a lot to us if you can support and do. Our patrons are the heart and soul of this show. So again, patreon.com/wingedwheelpodcast. Some questions from our patrons. Speaking of Marner, known Petry truther of the Mex-Canadian says, would you give up premium prospects and draft picks to get Mitch Marner?
With
an 1 year left.
Yeah, with an extension, yes, I would. Absolutely.
I joke a lot about, Marner's not a playoff player. And
that's perfect because the Red Wings don't make the playoffs.
Why you got to do that, Evan? But in all seriousness, Evan's not wrong. That's a problem you worry about when you're there. And you have to get there year in and year out before you can have that problem. So
would be a great way to fill the potential Patrick Kane void.
Yeah. It would be an expensive way. That contract would not be cheap.
No, absolutely not. But we've been sitting here for 9 years saying, holy crap, this team needs a star top six forward to help Larkin out. Thankfully, they drafted Lucas Raymond, and it's still not enough. So if you got to do it, you got to do it.
Avery Sloppy Second says, I think Axel Sandin Pellikka is playing defense out of camp, and I don't think that's a hot take. So more on this, Yzerman said they may leave him in Sweden for another year. They haven't decided or talked to him completely yet. I don't think it's a crazy take to say he could play so well and he makes it out of camp. But when you consider someone of Axel Sandin Pellikka's size and his skill set, it doesn't strike you as someone necessarily who will be able to adapt to the North American game fast. And that, not to say he won't do it well. Those are two very different things, and sometimes they can be mutually exclusive. So it's possible, but I would say it's unlikely in my mind.
Yeah, and he'd also have to leapfrog Johansson and a couple of the other guys in Grand Rapids. And outside of Johansson, I don't think any of the guys in Grand Rapids are exactly kicking down the door. But yeah, it's still way longer odds than not.
Right hand as opposed to left hand shot or left side D. But yeah, it also depends on what Yzerman can do to move out contracts. Like if you're stuck with most of your decor now, then you just simply don't have room. Udalali says, seeing as how this is a very important offseason on what Detroit does and doesn't do, should Yzerman have his eye on the pro scouting department to make some changes? In terms of at least the methodology and how they land on picking guys, I don't know whether that's the people or the process. Yeah. As Brad said, you can't have more misses because it's not like missing on a draft pick. If you miss on a draft pick, you essentially lose a draft pick. You miss on a contract, you're stuck with them. It's in this cap system. It's hard to shed those contracts. So you can't afford more than you have right now.
Yeah, the Red Wings have at least 2 very expensive misses right now, and it's hard enough to properly build a cap compliant team that's going to win the Stanley Cup with more than 1 expensive miss.
Josh Stella had an interesting one here. It says, as we head into the offseason, do you see any of the below as realistic top 6 forward options? And if so, what would you trade for them? I picked teams and cap crunchers who might be forced to ship players out. Adrian Kempe has 2 more years at $5.5 million. Brock Besser's 1 year at 6.65. Mitch Marner, 1 more year at 10.9. Or Matthew Nyes, who's an RFA. Or Sam Bennett, 1 year at 4.425. Anyone else you can think of?
Yeah, Sam Bennett, I'm not super interested in. The Red Wings have a million of his type. Even if he does it better than they do, he's not what they're missing. Nyes, Toronto isn't trading. Kempe, that would be the dream scenario. They're not trading him. They have a superstar cost controlled. Like, if they're moving anybody, it's not going to be him. Besser, I could see, but again, are you extending a guy who had several down years and then had a strong year? Not much interest in a rental. The most realistic one there might be Marner if the Leafs flame out in the first round again.
And if the Leafs do move to a reset, which I think they're overdue on by a couple of years, Matthews, obviously you're keeping. They just signed Nylander. Marner makes sense. You can reshuffle your team really well without his money and for the assets that you could get. I wish I pushed harder. Like I suggested Brock Besser last year when Vancouver was like a whole other team compared to what they are now. I don't know if it was actually the case, but you were hearing things at a time where, if you just took Brock Besser's contract, you could have done so for very cheap. I suggested it, and I really wish that would have happened because, man, it didn't take long for him to show that he still has his shooting talent. For everything that Detroit has added in terms of expensive contracts, I really, Besser would have been a great expensive contract to bring in. Man. Jeff Lehman says, just wanted to say after seeing how the Islanders and Capitals are being handled like the South Park kids versus Detroit, I'm not too terribly upset we missed this year. Brad said it earlier this episode. if the Red Wings made it, we would have been pumped. There would have been a lot of great content. We had a lot of cool stuff planned for you guys. I think all of our predictions would have been the other team in 4 or 5, maybe 6 if we're feeling crazy. There's 5 games would have been like the gentleman's sweep. I think you said, Brad, would have been like the most likely scenario. Detroit just didn't have the goaltending going into the playoffs for this. Bill Bull Hours, the eternal winner, says you're able to nullify one contract in the league, and the player whose contract is nullified cannot re-sign with the same team. Which contract do you choose? A bad contract with the Wings, a star player on a rival team to sabotage them, a useful player on another team that you think the Wings would be the front runner to sign?
I'll say Connor McDavid and then pray the Red Wings can sign him. That's the obvious answer there.
But then you'll move him to the East, and then Toronto will shed Marner's contract and he'll sign in Toronto.
Offer him the max contract. Do whatever you do to get him in Detroit. No, the realistic answer here, I'm probably just getting rid of Andrew Kopp's contract. I know it's a boring answer, but that solves a lot of problems right now.
I choose Austin Matthews because I think that's funny.
That'd be hilarious. But
he's going to the desert of Detroit.
Austin Matthews to Utah would be, first of all, if you're Alex Morello, you're punching the air so hard you might actually make contact. Secondly, get him out of the East. And third, oh my God, Utah would be immediately a huge market, but mostly it would cause Leafs fan pain, and I think that'd be funny. All right, on that note, we're going to wrap up this episode of the Winged Wheel Podcast. We'll save our other questions for the Patreon exclusive bonus overtime episode. Thank you all so very much for tuning into this episode. We didn't even get to talking about Dylan Larkin and Alex Lyon going to the Worlds to play for Team USA. So very obviously a lot of content coming up for you folks. We're going to continue our version of the discussion that we had on the roundtable today in future episodes. And if you haven't already listened to the season in review that we posted last Sunday, which is one of our mega episodes, I think the runtime was greater than an hour 40, which is longer than we typically do. But thank you all so much for tuning in. Thank you to Labatt Blue Light for sponsoring this episode of the Winged Wheel Podcast. And thank you to all of you who are tuning in. If you're tuning in for the first time, we are typically in person in studio, so forgive the remote audio quality, but also, thank you so much. If you want to support the show, patreon.com/wingedwheelpodcast. If Patreon's not for you, other ways you can support the show, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google, YouTube, and leave a rating, leave a thumbs up, leave a rating. It makes a big difference for us. So, really, really appreciate that. And to all of our name level supporters on Patreon, we could not do this without you. Arjun Shanker, Yves Bartels on behalf of the Sarah Grand Foundation, Aikfer, Samuel Soderholm, Icon, Victor Zetterberg, Brad's Lord and Savior Bradley Cleveland, Glenn Brabham, Croner's Left Knee, Ashley Van Conet, Sea Lion, Keenan O'Donohue, Yanni Burgers, Meals on Wheels, Matthew M. Rice, Admiral Matt S. of the Cheesebag Navy, Avery Sloppy Seconds, Brian Vasha, Carl Brutina Nanaluski, Carl Provy, Citizen High Five, Clip Clop Nene, Connor Scovey, Craig Kibble, Denny's Gamer Girl, Derek Enstam, Dickens, Seider, formerly Marlon Winchester, DJ Denton, God Creatives, Give Blood, Fight Probert, Have You Ever Drank Bailey's from a Shoe, Hockeytown Love, Hockeytown Matt, Hassam Al-Qassam, Jay Gollum, Jacob Turner, Joel Miranda, Jonathan Miller, Jonathan Tortiarella, Kalen Wood, Marcus, Matt Keeler, Matt McKay, Michael Edlund, R.A., Ryan 50, Hannah Cap, Hannah, Scott Martin, Screen Lube, That's What I Appreciates About You, Skeletor, Wallman's Elite Dancing D, Yzerplan Stan, General Andy Bohan of the Cheesebag Army, Sam Bankson, A.B., Adam Rose, Axel Sandin Pellikka, Bellingham Acid Balls, Brad Simmons, Chuck Buffchest, the Tarp Lagoon, Commander Ben Barron of the Cheesebag Space Force, Connor Leighton, Corey Prida, Darren Fick, Derek James, Eric Nance, new name level supporter, Evans Forth, Putt, new name level supporter, Frank Stanley, Gene Sullivan, Griffey Boy, James Pridemore, Jeremiah Dobo, JM Rhapsody, Joey Jojo Shabadoo. Thank you for splitting up the names so I could read it more phonetically. New name level supporter, John Evans Derogatory, John Ingalls, Josh Yelton, Kevin McCracken, Nolan Petry, Truth of the Mexinadian, Quaz, Les Grossman's Ungodly Firestorm, Linda Hull, Maximilian, Michigan Boy in Avs Country, Naruto's Punchable Face, Not Mad, Just Disappointed Wings Fan, Ophelia, Red Wing Tar Heel, Salt Lake Sugar Girly, Sean Mason, brand new name level supporter. Welcome to the Dub Dub Club. Steven, the Hodag, the Stanley Cup is a hyper trophy. The work doesn't stop. No, I won't be taking questions. The Hat 123, Tom Yzerplan Respecter, Wings fan in St. Louis, and your second favorite patron. Thank you all so very much, and we'll talk to you Sunday.
Thanks for tuning in to the Winged Wheel Podcast. Be sure to check out wingedwheelpodcast.com, where you can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll also find links to other ways to support the show, such as Patreon, official podcast apparel, and more. And don't forget to follow the show on Twitter at Winged Wheel Pod. And of course, the hosts at Brad Crisco, at Ryan Hanna WWP, and at Hockeytown Evan.